Imagine a time when India was the world's economic powerhouse. Back in 1700, India was a giant, accounting for a staggering 27% of the global economy. To put that into perspective, that was more than all of Europe combined. India wasn't just a land of riches, it was the beating heart of trade and industry. Its textiles, jewels, pottery, and metalworks were famous across the globe. The quality of Indian craftsmanship was unrivaled, and its merchants were highly respected. But as the story of so many empires goes, change was on the horizon. In 1707, the death of Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb set off a chain reaction. His death led to the unraveling of the mighty Mughal Empire. Weak rulers came and went, squabbling for control over a throne that was rapidly losing its power. The empire, which once united much of India, began to crumble under the pressure of infighting and regional battles. In this period of chaos, India was vulnerable. Then in 1739, a new threat emerged. The Persian Emperor Nader Shah invaded India. He sacked Delhi and took away immense wealth, but unlike the British, he didn't stay. He looted and then left, leaving India still in a fragile state. The British, however, saw an opportunity that others hadn't. They weren't interested in looting and leaving. They had much bigger plans. The British East India Company, a foreign trading company, began using the political chaos in India to expand its influence. The British weren't like the invaders that had come before. They didn't just plunder India and go home. Instead, they saw India as an endless gold mine, and they planned to make it serve their interests for years to come. India had been no stranger to foreign invaders. In the past, the Huns and other forces had come, but they had eventually become part of the fabric of India. The British, though, were different. They didn't just want India's wealth for a time, they wanted to change everything. By the time India won its independence in 1947, the country was in ruins. Its economy had collapsed, its industries had been destroyed, and its people were left impoverished. The India that once dazzled the world with its wealth and brilliance had been stripped of its riches. So, what happened to the thriving industries that once made India a leader in global trade? Let's start with textiles, for example. India had long been a textile superpower, with rich traditions of weaving, dyeing, and embroidery. By the mid-18th century, India controlled about 25% of the global textile trade. The demand for Indian textiles was so great that it helped create a global network of trade routes. These textiles weren't just popular for their beauty. They were a key driver of India's prosperity. But the British didn't want competition for their own industries, so they decided to shut it down. The British imposed heavy tariffs and monopolies, essentially forcing Indian artisans out of business. The British even sent soldiers to break Indian looms and, in some cases, even went as far as breaking the thumbs of skilled weavers to stop them from working. The consequences were devastating. Skilled artisans who had once been at the heart of India's booming industries became impoverished. It wasn't just textiles. India was also a global leader in shipbuilding. Indian ports like Dhaka, Surat, and Madras were famous for building strong, durable ships. The Bengali merchant fleet, for example, consisted of over 5,000 ships in the early 17th century, many capable of carrying hundreds of tons of cargo. These ships were built to last, far outliving the British ships of the time. But just like with textiles, the British didn't want to compete with India's shipbuilding industry either. So they started disrupting it, driving Indian shipbuilders out of business. And then there's steel. India had been making steel for centuries. The famous Damascus steel, known for its strength and beauty, came from India. Indian blacksmiths along the Malabar coast and in the Deccan were world-renowned for their metalwork. These Indian-made weapons, such as swords and knives, were so well made that they were prized not just for their use in battle, but also as symbols of wealth and status. But the British didn't want India to hold on to this expertise. They took control of the steel industry, driving Indian artisans out and destroying the markets for Indian metal goods. The British took control of every aspect of the economy, draining India of its wealth and forcing the country to serve British interests. The vast networks of trade that India had built up over centuries were severed. Indian merchants were left with no buyers for their goods, while the British flooded the market with cheap inferior products from Britain. To make matters worse, The British also extracted huge amounts of wealth from India through taxes, paying for Indian goods with money they had essentially stolen from the Indian people. By the time the British left in 1947, India was a shadow of its former self. The country had been deindustrialized, its people were divided, impoverished, and living in the wreckage of what had once been a flourishing, dynamic economy. The British didn't just exploit India for its resources, they deliberately crushed the nation's ability to rebuild and prosper. As the American scholar Will Durant famously put it, the British Empire's exploitation of India was the greatest crime in all of history. In just 200 years of colonial rule, the British tore apart an entire nation's economy and culture. The India that once inspired the world was unmade by a ruthless, calculating system designed to benefit only one group, the British. And so in the end, the mighty India that once stood as a beacon of wealth and power was reduced to a shadow of its former glory, its people left to pick up the pieces. As the British solidified their control over India, they didn't just exploit its wealth, they reshaped the entire economy to serve their needs. They stripped away nearly every form of manufacturing in India, turning the country into little more than a raw material supplier. India was now reduced to exporting things like cotton and metal ore, which were shipped off to Britain. The British would then sell finished goods back to the Indian people at a high price. In fact, one British official boldly admitted, "We conquered India as an outlet for the goods of Britain. I'm not such a hypocrite to say that we hold India for the Indians." That blunt statement pretty much sums up their approach. India's purpose was to benefit Britain and nothing more. The British monopoly on industrial production was so complete that by 1947, a tiny fraction of India's population, just 0.7%, was even involved in manufacturing. So what happened to the people who once worked in those thriving industries? The skilled artisans, merchants, and builders who were the backbone of India's economy had nowhere to go. With India's industries dismantled, many had no choice but to turn to agriculture for survival. But as Dr. Charles Hall noted, this wasn't an easy shift. India's population had been pushed back onto the land, but the soil couldn't support them all. The land simply wasn't enough to sustain the newly displaced workers. Poor harvests, droughts, and famines followed, deepening the misery and creating widespread poverty. Most people, now turned into peasant farmers, were struggling to make ends meet. The British, however, saw these peasants as a gold mine. They decided to tax them heavily to fund their empire. In fact, taxes on farmers were so extreme that they were expected to pay 50 to 80% of their income before the harvest. This meant that many peasants owed more in taxes than they could earn from their crops. The British were fully aware of how brutal these taxes were. They even admitted that they were imposing the highest tax rates in the world, 3 times higher than those under previous Indian rulers. But they didn't care. In fact, they proudly boasted about how much they were squeezing out of the Indian people in Parliament. One British official even said, "Indians have been taxed to the utmost limit. Every province has been made a field for higher exaction." The situation became so dire that 2/3 of the population in directly ruled areas fled to the rural hinterlands, hoping to escape the crushing taxes. Those who stayed behind struggled to pay and faced horrific punishments if they couldn't pay up. Tax defaulters were thrown in cages, exposed to the burning sun, or physically tortured. Some peasants even had to sell their children just to afford the taxes. And when the peasants couldn't pay, the British didn't hesitate to confiscate their land. For the first time in India's history, millions of people were turned into landless peasants, their livelihoods stolen from them. By the end of the 19th century, India had become Britain's largest source of revenue. It was also their biggest customer for British exports and a place where many British civil servants and soldiers were highly paid, all thanks to Indian taxes. Many British officials openly acknowledged that India was being exploited. In fact, one British Prime Minister, the Marquis of Salisbury, openly declared that India was meant to be bled of money. His words were as cold and brutal as the reality they represented. India and its people were drained, their wealth used to fuel Britain's empire. But what was even worse was that the British had no intention of ever becoming part of India. They didn't see themselves as a part of the land, but as outsiders with one goal: to take everything they could. They maintained what scholars have called an extractive colony, one designed purely to extract resources for Britain, with no regard for the well-being of the people who lived there. For comparison, think back to the Turkic peoples who invaded India centuries earlier and formed the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire. Sure, the Mughal Empire wasn't without its flaws. They imposed heavy taxes, engaged in religious discrimination, and often ruled with violence. But despite all of that, the Mughal rulers became part of India. Over time, they settled, adapted, and even embraced parts of Indian culture. The British, on the other hand, never did. They never saw India as their own. They simply used it as a source to fuel their empire until the very end. While India's Mughal rulers may have come from foreign lands, they became deeply loyal to their new home. Their focus was on preserving India's wealth and continuing its dominance in global trade, which accounted for a huge 27% of the world's commerce at the time. Unlike the British, who saw India as a place to extract wealth, the Mughals didn't take India's resources and send them back to their homeland. They invested in the land and its people, and India thrived under their rule. However, the British had a very different approach. They ruled India as distant overlords, with no loyalty to the land. They extracted India's wealth and sent it back to Britain. Modern economists estimate that the total wealth Britain extracted from India over the years is around a staggering $43 trillion. Yes, trillion. That's money that could have been invested in India, but was instead drained away, contributing to the country's poverty and decline. Some argue that the British railways are proof that the British developed India, but this is a misleading argument. The British railways weren't an act of benevolence. They were designed to serve British interests. The British assumed that India wouldn't have developed railways on its own, but India was already a leader in civilization and could have easily caught up had it been given the chance. Japan, in just 50 years, revolutionized its economy with modern technology, while India, under British rule, was held back. Initially, the British railways were presented as a great investment. However, the reality was far from it. The government guaranteed huge returns for British investors, at least 5% a year, no matter what. When the railways didn't generate enough money, Indian taxpayers were forced to cover the losses. The cost of building railways in India was incredibly inefficient. It cost £18,000 per mile in India, compared to just £2,000 in the United States. To make matters worse, the railways served primarily to extract India's resources for British gain. They made it easier for the British to transport grain and agricultural products out of India and into Europe, even during droughts. This led to devastating famines, with an estimated 35 million people dying from hunger during British rule. That's millions more than those who died under Stalin or Mao, and 5 times the number killed in the Holocaust. The British were directly responsible for these famines. They exported vast quantities of food to Britain and other European countries, even when droughts made food scarce in India. Dr. Charles Hall, a noted scholar, explained it clearly. India starves so that its annual tax revenue to England may not be diminished by $1. There was plenty of grain in India, but the people were so poor from exploitation that they couldn't afford it. The British government had no interest in helping the people of India. In fact, they actively avoided doing anything to stop the suffering. Famine relief efforts were even blocked by British authorities, who didn't want their failures exposed. One British officer described the horrors. Scores of corpses were tumbled into old wells because the deaths were too numerous for the relatives to perform funeral rites. And yet, the British government turned a blind eye. When people, both Indian and foreign, tried to help those suffering from hunger, the British government got angry and worked to stop them. They didn't want their mistakes to be seen. Newspapers were silenced and civilians were told not to acknowledge the widespread deaths. It's worth noting that India, after gaining independence in 1947, has not seen a single large-scale famine. Independent India has its flaws, but it has been far better at taking care of its people, ensuring their safety and prosperity, compared to the colonial rule under the British. And that's the truth. While British rule devastated India, independent India has managed to grow and improve, despite the enormous damage done during colonialism. The legacy of British exploitation is still felt today, but India's resilience shines through.